Okay, continuing on with our attributes of God in action. The next attribute we're going to look at is God's omnipresence. Omnipresence is God's attribute of being wholly present everywhere, in the fullness of his being, without being divided, diluted, or spatially extended. Psalm 139 is a key verse here. Where shall I where shall I flee from your presence? Even there your hand shall lead me. Jeremiah 23 asks, am I a God who is near and not a God far away? Do I not fill heaven and earth? Acts 17 says he is actually not far from each one of us. In him we live and move and have our being. Omnipresence needs to be distinguished. This is really important from pantheism. Pantheism is the false claim that God is the world, or that the world is an extension of God's being. And the idea is that God occupies physical space the way we do, and we need to just be careful about falling from omnipresence into pantheism. Something that I do want to bring up with this is that we do need to think careful about omnipresence when it comes to actually the doctrine of hell. And I don't want to get fully into this yet, but I will say that there are, amongst even your traditional classical theologians, there are people who have disagreements on how does omnipresence apply with the doctrine of hell. Is God present in hell, or is hell the absence of God's presence? And there are people who disagree on that, and that's something that you could look at and you could research and take a position on if you wanted to. But that's something to just be aware of when we talk about the doctrine of omnipresence. We also want to talk about the doctrine of omnipotence. Omnipotence is God's attribute of possessing all power, such that he is able to do all that he wills, and this is really important, in accordance with his own perfect nature. Scripture supports this. Genesis 18 asks, is anything too hard for the Lord? Jeremiah 32 says, nothing is too hard for God, who made the heavens and the earth by his great power. Matthew 19 says that with God, all things are possible. When Job is talking with God, he says, I know that you can do all things. But Orthodox theology always qualifies omnipotence carefully to avoid caricature. So, what do I mean by that? God cannot do what is logically contradictory. So, you hear things like, make a square circle. This isn't a limitation on God's power. It's a recognition that contradiction isn't a coherent thing to be done in the first place. That God doesn't do things that are contradictory. Second, God cannot act contrary to his own nature. He can't deny himself. He cannot lie, and he cannot sin. Again, this isn't weakness. This is perfection. The capacity to sin would be a deficiency on God, not an enhancement of his power. The third is that God's omnipotence is exercised in accordance with his decreed will, which means that God doesn't just not do things that are merely possible. He only does things that he has purposed to do. So God doesn't do everything. He does things that he has purposed to do. So omnipotence is all power, but this is really important. It's rightly qualified. In other words, God is a God of order. He is a God of consistency. And so when we talk about omnipotence, we should expect that all to be done within logic, within things that make sense together, that are coherent, that are consistent with who God is and with his will. Omniscience is the next one I want to talk about. That is exhaustive, perfect knowledge. Omniscience is God's attribute of knowing all things, past, present, future, actual, and possible, the deepest secrets of every heart. He knows us exhaustively. He knows us perfectly. There is no process of learning or discovery for God. God is not learning more as time goes on. Psalm 147 says that his understanding is beyond measure. Hebrews 4 says, no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. First John says God knows everything. Isaiah 46 says that God declares the end from the beginning. Omniscience includes God's knowledge of all actual events, his knowledge of things in the past, his knowledge of things in the present, and his knowledge of things in the future. It also includes his knowledge of all possible events that could occur. Knowledge of possibilities. This is actually where theologians get into debate on the notion of middle knowledge, where they debate precisely how God's knowledge of possibilities relates to his knowledge of what will actually occur. And this is, again, something of ongoing respectful debate. Particularly, we see this debate arising between Reformed, Arminian, and other evangelical traditions. And this comes up later in soteriology, the study of salvation, and particularly it comes up when we start talking about Calvinist type debates. So whatever your position is on the relationship between divine foreknowledge and human freedom, what we do need to know is that historic Christian orthodoxy is unanimous that God's knowledge is genuinely exhaustive. It is certain. It's never partial. It's never mistaken. And God is never surprised. An important term to know when we talk about omniscience is what's known as process theology. And process theology would argue against omniscience as we've defined it, and say that God learns over time, and we want to avoid that notion. No, God knows all things, past, present, future, actual, and possible, exhaustively, without learning or discovery.